Okay, friends, here we are today, Lecture 5, and we're going to explore one of the most remarkable and often overlooked periods in Christian history, the age of the Church of the East right before Islam, before the eve of Islam, roughly in the 6th to the 7th centuries or so. This was a time of great life, great vitality for the Church of the East, and great confidence. Remember, in the previous lecture, we spoke of how the Church of the East had survived persecution and was now becoming fully rooted in the Persian world, especially after Yazdgerd I had recognized Christianity as a legal religion within his realm. Certainly not the prominent religion, but rather a legal religion for now. And it was a church that was, as we will soon see, that's both deeply monastic as well as deeply, deeply missionary. It's contemplative in spirit, but astonishingly, it is global in reach. Now, by the eve of Islam, it stretched all the way, the Church of the East stretched all the way from the heart of Mesopotamia into India and even into China, with some historians saying that it might have even gone as far as Japan during this time. And it had done all of this without imperial sponsorship, relying only on the faith and initiative of its monks, bishops, and lay believers. Remember that during the same time, the Romans had made Christianity the official religion, and so Roman Christianity had enjoyed that imperial sponsorship, but the Church of the East enjoyed none of that. Rather, again, it relied on lay believers, it relied on the faithful, on the bishops, on the monks, in order to spread the gospel throughout Asia. All right, friends, as we take a look at an overview of the Church of the East in the 6th and 7th centuries, we see a golden age, a flourishing of the Church of the East. Now, remember, after many long years, many decades of persecution under the early Sasanian kings, most notably Shapur II, as we had talked about in an earlier lecture, the Church had finally found its footing, right? It finally found its footing right after these disastrous, these horrendous persecutions, and through synods began to reorganize itself, and no longer was it a persecuted minority or a political liability. Rather, it became recognized as a loyal and stable community within the Persian Empire. Now, the empire's rulers, as we have seen, needed an educated populace. They needed educated administrators. They needed educated physicians, skillsmen, tradesmen, and oftentimes looked towards the Christians, who were well trained in languages and sciences through the monastic schools that they had throughout the empire. Now, at the same time, the Church of the East during this time began to really see itself more and more unique as a Persian church and as an independent Persian church of sorts, right? It's not under the direct control or authority of Rome or Constantinople, as it had its own Catholicos, its own synods, and a uniquely Syriac theological language. Now, this unique identity as Persian allowed it to really flourish in the Persian Empire. And one of the most notable things that we see is that it developed a spirituality and missionary energy that few other churches could really match during the same time. We see in the interior provinces, what we mean by interior provinces is those in the traditional provinces of the Persian Empire, and those that had been already evangelized previous to the 6th and 7th centuries. We see monastic and ascetic reform in these times. And in the exterior expansion, meaning in the exterior provinces, later on they'll be called, in the exterior provinces, there are missions that carry the gospel along what again was known as the Silk Road. Remember, the Silk Road is what carried traders in deep into China, named after silk, one of the most precious commodities from China to be traded throughout Asia and into the Roman world. But through that road, if you remember from the first lecture, a couple lectures ago, we talked about the Persian Royal Road that allowed for effective evangelization throughout Persia. The Silk Road allowed for effective and safe passage throughout Asia, and therefore allowed for the spread of Christianity throughout Asia. And we'll see more about that in just a moment. If we remember, the Sasanian Empire, founded in the 3rd century, had long seen Christianity as suspicious, right? The Sasanians had taken over from the Parthians, and the Parthians could care less about Christianity. They weren't too good at running the central government very effectively, and they were more interested in other things than persecuting religions. But rather, the Sasanians had seen Christianity as very suspicious, a potential threat to the existence of their empire. They saw the Christians as spies for Rome. They saw them as a potential, so to speak, fifth column for the Romans. But by the mid 500s, by the mid 6th century or so, that fear had mostly subsided. The Persians had realized that the Church of the East was not Roman. It had its own theology, its own leaders, and its own loyalties. In fact, many of the Persian Christians had served in the army or in the government or in various positions throughout Persia. Now, a key figure in this transformation during this time was Mar Abba, who served as Catholicos or Patriarch of the Church of the East from 540 to 552. Now, Mar Abba was an extraordinary man. He was born a Zoroastrian. He was educated in both Greek and Syriac, and later he had converted to Christianity. He had brought to his leadership a rare combination of intellectual breadth and spiritual depth. He reformed the church's structure, insisted on proper education for clergy, enforced the disciplines of fasting, prayer, and celibacy that had waned after many years of hardship on the Church of the East. He also encouraged with great zeal the translation of Greek theological texts into Syriac and corresponded with the Western churches, showing that although the Church of the East had its own authority, it still saw itself as a part of the universal Christian world. Now, under Mar Abba, the church entered a period of calm stability, politically secure, spiritually disciplined, and intellectually alive. So, friends, in order to understand the Church of the East theology in a greater way, we need to place it alongside its Western Syriac neighbors, what are today called the Syriac Orthodox Church, sometimes mislabeled the Jacobites, just as we are mislabeled as Nestorians. They are also labeled as Jacobites as well, named after one of the prominent theologians of the Syriac Orthodox Church. But what's remarkable here is that both groups spoke Syriac, read the same scriptures, and shared very similar liturgies. If you want to refresh your memories on this part in particular, again, Dr. Fastigi in earlier lectures gave a great synthesis, great explanation, and a great lecture on Christology and the theology of the Church of the East. So go back, refresh your memory, try to read more, reread it, rewatch it, restudy it. There's always more that can be gained by restudying something over and over again, new insights that are made, and a deeper appreciation for again, the knowledge that you receive about God. But regardless, both groups again spoke Syriac, they read the same scriptures, and they shared very similar liturgies, but they had very different theological orientations. The Church of the East followed the Antiochene tradition, if you remember, the theology of Theodore Mapasuestia, and later on this became attributed to Nestorius. The school emphasized the full humanity of Christ, his real human will and freedom, and his genuine experience of suffering. They spoke of Christ as having two gnome, two concrete natures or essences, divine and human, united in one prosopon or person. Remember that? Good. The Jacobites, or the Syriac Orthodox Church, by contrast, they followed the Alexandrian or the Monophysite tradition of Cyril of Alexandria, which stressed the unity of Christ's nature after the incarnation, one incarnate nature of the Word of God. Now, to the Greeks, this difference really seemed maybe technical, maybe even semantics, but in the Syriac world, it produced real division. Each side accused the other of misunderstanding the mystery of Christ. The Church of the East was called Nestorian by its rivals, and likewise, the Church of the East saw the Jacobites as confusing Christ's humanity and divinity. Yet, after you read the readings on the Church of the East during this time, as well as its relations with the Jacobites, you might think they always want to get one over, or whatever it might be, on the other side. We see, though, in cities like Edessa, Nisibis, and Tikrit, where it is maybe like in border towns, they often coexisted, even sometimes sharing monasteries or schools. Monks and scholars would cross boundaries to debate theology and maybe even exchange texts. And so, even in the midst of rivalry, there was a mutual respect, a mutual understanding that they were still brothers and sisters in Christ. Now, bear with me for this lecture. I want to touch on monasticism, the Qiyamah movement, especially because it forms the very foundation of monasticism in the Church of the East. We have to talk about it because this was, again, a flourishing time in the Church of the East, especially in the area of monasticism. Now, before the rise of organized monasteries, the Church had what we might call a proto-monastic tradition known as the Qiyamah, or the covenant movement. The term Qiyamah means standing, those who stand before God. Men and women called the sons and daughters of the covenant. They lived consecrated lives of prayer, celibacy, service, and they did this all without withdrawing from society. They lived in their villages, they worked ordinary jobs, and yet they devoted their lives entirely to Jesus Christ. They were the early catechists, the teachers, the caregivers, the liturgical leaders of their communities. We can think of them as the beating heart of the early Christian life in Persia. They're quietly sustaining the faith at the very grassroots, at the very foundation. Now, this movement was really the preparation grounds, the preparation soil for the formal monasticism that was going to take place later on. When later monks withdrew to the deserts or the mountains, they were not creating something new. They were formalizing a spirituality that had already been present among the faithful. Now, by the 6th century, monasticism had become the defining feature of the church's spirituality. Monasteries were everywhere, in Mesopotamia, along the Tigris and Euphrates, and in the mountain valleys of Persia. Figures like Mar Abda, Mar Ojin, and Mar Abraham of Kashgar had organized communities of monks who lived a rhythm of prayer, study, and labor. Their ideal was the apostolic life, modeled on the early church as it's found in Acts, where believers lived in common, they prayed together, and they shared their goods. These monasteries were not isolated from the world, but they were centers of learning, charity, and mission. Now, the school of Nisibis, for example, became the intellectual heart of the church, and it trained generations of clergy, theologians, and missionaries. Its curriculum included scripture, theology, logic, medicine, and languages, and it preserved the works of the Greek fathers like Basil and St. John Chrysostom, translating them into Syriac. It was, in effect, a university, centuries before the first Western universities had existed. Monks also served as physicians and copyists. They preserved medical and philosophical texts that would later pass into the Islamic world through translation. At the same time, their prayer life was very, very rigorous, anchored in the Psalms, the Divine Office, what's called the Hudra, and the daily Eucharistic celebration. The fusion of study and spirituality, learning and holiness became the hallmark of Eastern monasticism. Now, I want to for a moment to return to Mar Abba. His reforms gave lasting shape to both the clergy and the monastic life. For example, he noticed that as the church grew comfortable, some of its early fervor had failed. And so he called the clergy and the monastics back to their roots, to simplicity, to fasting, to study, and to service. He enforced clerical celibacy, not out of disdain for marriage, but as a sign of total dedication to God's service. He restored the rhythm of liturgical prayer and emphasized that education was a spiritual duty, not a luxury. Mar Abba's reforms made the church a moral and intellectual beacon within Persia. Even Zoroastrian priests, who didn't really care for the Christians and even once opposed Christianity, respected his wisdom and his moderation. He became a model of holiness, a patriarch who combined the courage of a reformer with the humility of a monk. Now, naturally, under good leadership, you're going to see that the monasteries of the Church of the East were not, again, enclosed cloisters as we have spoken of before, but they were missionary outposts. From Mesopotamia eastward, they stretched a network of monasteries that doubled as hostels, schools, and way stations for travelers and traders. Now, monks saw mission not as a separate task, but as part of their vocation. They believed that to pray for the world meant also to go out into the world, and so they set out along the great trade routes, the Persian Royal Road and the Silk Road, and they preached, they taught, and they established Christian communities as far as the very frontiers of China. Their evangelization was remarkably adaptive. They learned the local languages wherever they went, even Chinese and various other languages such as Sanskrit, and translated the scriptures and liturgical texts into those languages. And they did not impose foreign customs. Instead, they clothed the gospel in the culture of the people that they served. This cultural sensitivity explains why the Church of the East could spread across so many diverse societies and survive for centuries. Now, the results of this missionary movement are astounding. In India, for example, the Church of the East maintained and strengthened the ancient St. Thomas Christian communities on the Malabar coast. Now, these Indian Christians had preserved the East Syrian liturgy and maintained contact with Mesopotamian bishops for over 1,000 years. In Central Asia, the Church had founded bishoprics in Merv, Samarkand, and Kashgar. Christianity took deep root among the Persian nobility, among Turkic tribes, and even in the heart of the Silk Road oasis cities. In 635 AD, you see that there is a monk by the name of Alopen who arrives at the court of the Tang Emperor Taizong in China. Now, Taizong, the emperor, known for his wisdom and his tolerance, had welcomed the Church of the East monk Alopen and ordered the Christian scriptures to be translated into Chinese. Christianity, known in Chinese as the luminous religion or Jingzhao, was officially recognized. Churches and monasteries were built across the Chinese Empire. By 781, you have what's known as the famous Nestorian stele, which was established in Xi'an, the capital of China, and it recorded 150 years of Christian life and mission in China. It described how the gospel had come from Syria, bringing the true teaching of the Messiah and uniting East and West in one faith. This is one of the great missionary achievements of Christian history, the first true global church. Now, as the church expanded, it inevitably encountered other religions: Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and eventually Islam. Now, what's striking is how the Church of the East engaged these traditions, not through confrontation, but through dialogue and cultural exchange. Right? Its monks, we've seen, has translated Greek philosophy and Syriac theology into Persian, and later on will do so into Arabic as well. They play a key role in preserving and transmitting the works of Aristotle, for example, and Plato to later generations. The church's missionary style was thus both spiritual and intellectual. Its evangelization often began with friendship and learning, with teaching medicine, mathematics, or astronomy, and only then introducing the gospel. This was a church that converted not by force, but by the beauty of truth that was lived out in holiness and wisdom. Now, I want us to understand the context that we find ourselves in before we talk about the eve of Islam, before we talk about Islam in the next lecture. But as we talk about the eve of Islam, the coming of Islam, we have to understand that by the early 7th century, the Church of the East stood at the very height of its strength and influence. It was, quite literally, the most geographically widespread Christian church in the world, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Tibet, and yet, despite its vast reach, it remained spiritually cohesive. The same liturgy of Edda and Mari was prayed in Mesopotamia as it was prayed in India and in the heart of China, for example. The same theological tradition, rooted in the Antiochian exegesis of Theodore of Mopsuestia and refined by scholars like Babai the Great, gave shape to homilies and catechesis and monastic life. It had matured into a church with its own synodical structures, its own canon law, and its own intellectual institutions. Its bishops met regularly in synods. Its monasteries were bustling centers of theological formation and missionary training. Its clergy were educated, disciplined, and fluent in several languages, regarded as the best trained in all of Asia, maybe all of the world. Politically, the church was a part of the Sasanian Empire, the great rival of Rome, especially the eastern half of the Roman Empire, later on known as Byzantium. For 3 centuries, Persia and Rome had clashed repeatedly. Various wars in Syria, Armenia, Mesopotamia, with Christian communities always caught in between. Now, by the 6th and 7th centuries, things had begun to change for the Christians of Persia. The Church of the East had secured legal recognition and learned to flourish within Persian society. Christian physicians began to serve in the royal courts. Christian scribes worked in the imperial bureaucracy, and Christian teachers taught in Persian academies. And this meant that by the time Arab armies had swept out of Arabia in the 630s, the Christians of the East were no strangers to life in an empire that was pluralistic. They had already learned how to be a minority, loyal, productive, and at peace with neighbors of other faiths. Now, the Patriarchate of Seleucia Ctesiphon, near modern-day Baghdad today, was the heart of this church. It was a bustling city of trade and scholarship, where Syriac, Persian, Greek, and Aramaic mingled in daily speech. Now, from this center, the church governed a network of dioceses that again stretched throughout Asia, from Nisibis to later on Merv, Herat, and even Samarkand in Central Asia. Its missionaries and merchants traveled along the same trade routes that carried silk, spices, and most importantly, ideas. They brought with them not political ambition, but a simple conviction, and one they carried with great courageous faith, that the gospel of Christ belonged to all peoples. Now, the world around them was about to change dramatically. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Sasanian Empire were so exhausted by war with each other, decades and decades of war with one another, that they were collapsing under their own weight. They no longer had the ability to continue to fight on and drag out along these wars. They were economically drained, politically divided, and spiritually they were just fatigued. They created a vacuum into which a new power would rise, the power of Islam. When the Prophet Muhammad began to preach in the early 7th century, the Church of the East was at its peak, its missionaries active, its monasteries thriving. Yet, within a generation, much of its territory would fall under Muslim control. And here is one of the most remarkable facts of Christian history. The Islamic conquests did not destroy the Church of the East. Where other institutions had crumbled, this church had endured, and in many places even prospered. It adapted to the new way of life, the new order of things, with much intelligence and humility that it needed, but it continued to thrive.